Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee.
My partner and I chose William Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? My primary source for this is the textbook. In the opening pages of the textbook, it speaks of how highly important the sonnet is in the 16th century, and how poets and writers felt the need to write them as a sign of their mastery of the form. To write a good sonnet, the writer had to have a good ear for verse, rhythm, rhyme, and be able to make a memorable argument in a short space that would surprise and startle the reader. Note that most sonnets written in this period are not always what they seem to be and can play tricks on the reader. The book puts forth Shakespeare's Sonnet 18 as the most famous English sonnet, where the sonnet is described as a love poem, and then it goes into the controversy surrounding it as to whether or not the writer had a sexual relationship with the young man the poem was about, or whether the writer even wrote the sonnet. It gives a basic instruction on sonnet structure line by line. The sonnet was usually a poem of 14 lines, with a complicated rhyme scheme that could vary and alter the structure or balance of the poem. The first 8 lines would usually describe something or a situation, making up an octave. The concluding 6 lines, the sestet, would comment on them, drawing a moral or a point. The sonnet could also be divided further into 3 units of 4 lines, quatrains, concluding with a couplet, or 2 lines, that commented on what had gone before, which was a preferred form for English writers, especially Shakespeare. Sonnet 18 is the form of the latter. It's the division of the 4 lines. It then explained how the English sonnet was born and how it differed from the Italian sonnets. Italian sonnets were written in the Petrarchan form, which is the octave. The first 8 lines are rhymed A-B, 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 or A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A, and the sestet, the last 6 lines, are C-D-E, C-D-E, C-D-C-C-D-C, or C-D-C-D-C-D. The English sonnet was born due to the fact that there were not enough words to rhyme, and the result was the birth of the English sonnet, which employed far more words and so made it possible for poets to use their wit and imagination more easily and freely. The usual rhyme scheme of the English sonnet is A-B, A-B, C-D, C-D, E-F, E-F, G-G, giving the poet at least 2 more words to use than the Italian version. Where the Italian sonnet was divided up into an octave and a sestet, the English sonnet contained 3 quatrains that described the substance of the poem and a couplet that commented on its significance. Just before the section on the sonnets, it gave us a brief history on William Shakespeare's life, what little that we know about it. Shakespeare was born in a provincial town of Stratford-on-Avon that was a 3-day journey from London by carriage, which was their only transportation at that time. His father was John Shakespeare, a glover and a local justice of the peace. His mother, Mary Arden, came from a family that owned considerable land in the country. The book says that he probably went to a local grammar school where he learned Latin and read histories of the ancient worlds. At 18, Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway, not the actress, who was 26. In the next 3 years, they had a daughter, Susanna, and then twins, Hamnet and Judith. 6 years later, perhaps after periods of teaching school in Stratford, he went to London, eventually in 1594, to join one of the great theatrical companies of the day, the Chamberlain's Men. It was with this company that he began his career as an actor, manager, and playwright. In 1599, the troupe began to put on plays at the Globe, an outdoor theater in Southwark, not far from other principal theaters of the days like the Rose and the Bear Garden and the Swan, across the river from the city of London itself. And because these theaters were outside of the city limits, they were also outside of the jurisdiction of the city laws, which meant that they were free to write plays that were able to examine parts of life or controversial parts of life without being caught or without being criticized. The book goes on to say that when James I ascended the throne in 1603, Shakespeare's company became the King's Men and played also at the court and at Blackfriars, the indoor theater inside London. Some people believe that the change of venue from going from outside London to inside London was the reason for his later elusiveness and his innuendos as was not there in his prior works. It then goes into some detail about his plays. There is a short section on the sonnets and how the first 14 sonnets out of the total 154 are telling of a young man to marry and have children, and were possibly commissioned by the young man's family. Neither the young man nor his family are known. The book gives a short description about the To a Young Man sonnets and the Dark Lady sonnets. The aesthetic of the Elizabethan period was all about love and religion. Writers and playwrights strove to meet these goals in order to be noticed by the royal court, and yet they had to be very careful about what they wrote or produced, otherwise they could be in great trouble. It was difficult during this period because of the censorship that took place. My next source is a review by Cecil M. Jaginski of a work by Cynthia S. Clegg called Press Censorship in Elizabethan England. Here he goes over Miss Clegg's work, where she attempts to downplay the censorship situation in Elizabeth I's reign. There was a company called the Stationers' Company, which was started by Queen Mary and stayed in place during Elizabeth's reign. This company had a pretty free hand at what it would and what it could suppress and censor. Miss Clegg's attempt to downplay this fact by stating others that there is a clear evidence throughout this period that the press was only censored structured around religion and seditious literature, which within itself is a huge suppression in my opinion. Miss Clegg, however, feels that it is not. Mr. Jaginski disagrees with her interpretation, but states that the book will give students of this field new reading material. Then my next source is Emily E. Stockard, Patterns of Consolations in Shakespeare's Sonnets. She states that Sonnet 18 shifts the term of the problem that is the mutability of beauty, so that the only recourse to save beauty is the poetry. This is a breakdown of the poem. She states that the first two lines are a misdirection, and then it goes on to claim the superiority of art over nature and to define nature's primary flaw as that of mutability, which means that nature is ever-changing and that beauty fades. When this is defined as a flaw, she says that the eternal lines of the poet can make verse superior to nature's changing course. By Shakespeare offering his poetry as a means of consolation for the young man's loss of beauty, he is establishing a link between them. This connection will prove to be both a great sorrow and consolation, and that through his words the young man's beauty will live on forever, so she states. I agree with this, but it does call into question the nature of love between Shakespeare and the young man. Robert E. Jungmann, Trimming Shakespeare's Sonnet 18. This source is another person's view on how to break down the poem. Mr. Jungmann states that the first 8 lines speak of the mutability of all things including beauty, and in the next 6 there is a complete reversal, an assertion that the poet's own verse will transcend change and even death itself and keep his friend alive. Notice that he says friend and not lover. He uses Stephen Booth's interpretation of the word untrimmed in the sense that it usually means to be stripped of fancy clothes and ornaments. He states, however, that the word can be taken to mean something else. He gives it a nautical connotation. In line 8 of the sonnet, the word untrimmed can therefore mean unadjusted. Unadjusted in that time could also mean sailing, unadjusted sails, or unadjusted cargo within the ship, and it also refers to nature's ever unchanging course. The fact that nature is forever changing is within itself a moot point. He therefore says the sonnet both denies and confirms mutability, and I agree with this. Richard Byrne, The Writer's Tale. Richard Byrne evaluates Stephen Greenblatt's biography on Shakespeare's elusive life book called Will in the World, How Shakespeare Became Shakespeare. There are other people to whom he references as well. In this review or evaluation, Mr. Byrne lays out many points in the book which are not only interesting but at times controversial. For instance, was Shakespeare a closet Catholic in a time when being Catholic was punishable by fines or death if discovered? There was a particular quote I like. It is as follows. Anyone who was alert in this world was immersed in the symbolic language of religion. This is the great struggle that was defining life. Shakespeare, if he was a Catholic, would have had to have been very careful. And Mr. Greenblatt argues that Shakespeare's close encounter with religious fanaticism shaped the reasoned sensibility of his plays. This infers that if Shakespeare was a closet Catholic, he was brought up to the two extremes, the fair weather and the extreme. There is an argument posed by Mr. Miola that the case of the Catholic influence on Shakespeare was a good one, but that it was difficult to assess adult belief from this influence in his plays, in his poems and his plays. He says that there are very Protestant moments of false miracle in the Henry VI play, but you have a brief belief in at least the poetic value of the power of purgatory in Hamlet. Mr. Miola goes on to say that the political and religious oppression of Catholics is only beginning to be understood and reevaluated. Shakespeare definitely registered these conflicts in his works. Mr. Greenblatt is more careful with his sonnets in the book, more careful with Shakespeare's sonnets in his book, because Shakespeare's sexuality and the identity of his lovers from the poems are still in conflict. He says that Shakespeare set traps in his sonnets for the reader, which I believe is true because they can be viewed either way. For instance, according to Mr. Greenblatt, some of the sonnets may have been written to persuade a young earl to marry against his wishes and his inclination not to do so. On the whole, this source brings up more question about Shakespeare and his works, the meanings behind them, as well as his personal life. Robert Matz, The Scandal of Shakespeare's Sonnets. Mr. Matz reviews the work of Margherita de Grazia, who believes that the scandals of the sonnets written about the young man are false accusations, and it is in fact the later sonnets written about the dark lady which are truly scandalous. She claims that the young man's sonnets merely represent the replacement of the family line, the inheritance from father to son, that Shakespeare celebrates in his previous sonnets. So she states that he does this by making reproduction a matter of poetry rather than sex. Shakespeare takes the place of two members of the young man's family, the son who will reproduce the young man, and the wife who is responsible for the reproduction, which I find a little suspect. She also states that in Shakespeare's time when the sonnets were written, that they may have had the potential to transgress the boundary of lines of proper male-to-male behavior. We are asked to remember that sexual behavior between men, oftentimes when unprosecuted, was commonplace and was even celebrated. When we read these sonnets, we may find this to be scandalous because of the apparent rigidness of the period. However, after reading these, things seem to have been more lax than I thought, except in the area of sex within marriage. That was still seen as suspicious even though you were married to the husband or the wife. Very strange. Mr. Matz states that if Shakespeare pushed the boundaries with his young man sonnets, then he did the same thing with the sonnets addressed to the dark lady, thereby making them both scandalous and yet not. In the end, Shakespeare's sonnets, which seem to celebrate the relationships between both men and women, are behaviors that have lasted long past Shakespeare and his poets of his time. Phoebe Pettingill, In Love with Shakespeare. She reviews Anthony Holden's book, William Shakespeare, The Man Behind the Genius. In it, Holden claims that Shakespeare was a closet Catholic in a Protestant England, and that this explains Shakespeare's secrecy, which is why we know so little about him. Mr. Holden is most adamantly against the homosexuality aspect of the sonnets to the young man. He backs his claim up by dragging out stories of Shakespeare's dalliances with his landladies. Miss Pettingill then brings Mr. Frank Kermode, who states that he is not surprised by the way that English writers and poets could pack multiple meanings into a word or a phrase. Though we know so little about Shakespeare the man, we can get a sense of him through his works. But that our knowledge of him is confined to just his works, and we may never know whether he felt emotions about what he wrote. I believe that he did, or his works would have been dry and vapid and completely devoid of all emotion. We're good.